October 12th, 2019. The air inside the abandoned Blackwood mine hung thick with silence, 40 years of dust, coal, and memory pressed into the damp stone. Deputy Marcus Tanner's boots crunched over gravel as his flashlight cut a trembling path through the darkness. The beam caught droplets of water sliding down the walls like cold sweat. Every sound, the drip, the breath, the echo, felt wrong, as if the mine itself was holding its breath. He'd come out here on a nuisance call. Teenagers trespassing again. Nothing new, but the deeper he went, the more he realized no kids had made it this far. The tunnel was too narrow, the air too heavy. Then he saw it, an uneven wall of timber and rock, not natural collapse, but built by human hands. A barrier. Someone had wanted this place sealed. Tanner knelt, his light sweeping across the crude wall. Between the stones, fabric. Faded, blue, frayed. He pulled one rock free, then another. The smell that rose up was old and human. Behind the barrier, the beam found two skeletons, side by side in the dirt. Bits of identical blue cloth clung to their bones, waitresses' uniforms, long decayed. And resting near one fragile wrist was a silver locket, tarnished but unmistakable, engraved with the initials S.M. Eights! Tanner froze. The breath caught in his chest. Everyone in Pike County knew those initials. Sarah Martinez, one half of the Martinez twins, missing since the autumn of 1974. For 45 years, their disappearance had been the open wound of this community. Two young women who walked home one evening and vanished into legend. Tonight, that legend had cracked open. And as you picture that beam of light sweeping over the earth's hidden truth, ask yourself, what else is buried out there, waiting for someone brave enough to look? Before we uncover what lay hidden in these cold case files for 45 years, hit subscribe, because sometimes justice waits a lifetime. The discovery at Blackwood Mine would later be described as the moment Pike County's oldest mystery finally exhaled. But to understand how those two skeletons ended up sealed behind a wall of rock, you have to go back to a Thursday evening in October 1974, when everything still felt safe. It was October 17th, the kind of fall day that made small towns in Alabama feel frozen in amber. Main Street glowed under the flicker of neon signs. The scent of fried onions and black coffee drifted from Murphy's Diner, where the Martinez twins worked the late shift. Inside, the clatter of plates and the buzz of conversation filled the air, the kind of background noise that makes life seem ordinary, until the night it isn't. Sarah and Rebecca were 20 years old, identical twins but opposite souls. Sarah, older by 7 minutes, wore her hair parted to the left and carried herself with quiet confidence. She saved every dollar for nursing school, kept a small notebook of goals in her apron pocket. Rebecca, Becca to her friends, was the spark. She laughed easily, flirted harmlessly, sang along to the jukebox when her boss wasn't looking. If Sarah was the planner, Becca was the dreamer. They'd grown up just a few miles away, the daughters of Robert and Maria Martinez, who had moved from Arizona when Robert got work as a foreman at Blackwell Mining, the same mine where, decades later, their bodies would be found. That Thursday, the twins clocked in at 2. Usidares P.M., serving coffee and pie to farmers, salesmen, and tired factory workers. Customers loved them. The regulars swore the diner felt emptier when the twins weren't on shift. Sarah kept the tables moving. Becca kept the room alive. They'd done it hundreds of times. Same uniforms, same walk home, same routine. Predictable. Safe. Like so many stories buried in the cold case files, it began as an ordinary night. By 8, 00BP. M. The dinner rush had thinned. The twins finished wiping the counter, counted their tips, and hung their aprons on the back hook. The night manager remembered Sarah calling out, "See you tomorrow." She always said that. She believed in tomorrows. They stepped out into the October air, cool, dry, the smell of wood smoke on the breeze. Streetlights hummed overhead. The girls laughed about a customer who'd left a 50-cent tip on a $10 check. Normal talk. Familiar footsteps. From the diner on Main Street to their house on Pine, it was a 12-minute walk they had made hundreds of times. Past the courthouse square, past Henderson's pharmacy, past the white church with the tall steeple that caught moonlight like a blade. If you were walking down that same stretch tonight, you might feel what they felt, safe in the rhythm of a small town that seemed to know every face, every sound, every shadow. You wouldn't expect evil to be waiting under a streetlight. You'd think the danger was somewhere else, far away, not here, not in a place where everyone waved from their porch. At 8:15 p.m. They stopped at Henderson's to buy a birthday card for their mother. The clerk remembered them well. Two smiling girls, polite, cheerful. One asked for a card with roses on it. "Mama loves roses," she'd said. That was the last confirmed sighting of the Martinez twins alive. By 9:00 p.m., their mother noticed the silence. Dinner sat untouched on the table. By 10:00, she called Murphy's Diner. They'd left hours earlier. By 11:00, Robert was driving through Troy's narrow streets, headlights sweeping the ditches, calling their names into the wind. When midnight came, they called the sheriff. But in 1974, missing young women were often written off as runaways. Deputy Calvin Brooks, who'd later admit his regret, remembered saying, "Let's wait until morning." 8:00. Morning came, and the twins didn't. Searchers fanned out through the neighborhoods, fields, and wooded creeks. Volunteers, hundreds of them, joined the search. By day 3, the FBI had arrived. Flyers with the twins' photographs plastered every shop window. School kids passed them out after class. The town that had always left its doors unlocked began bolting them shut. But there was nothing. No blood, no purse, no shoes, not even a scream reported. It was as if the sisters had been plucked off the earth. And yet, hidden in plain sight, the first clue waited just yards from where they were last seen. A blue Ford pickup had been spotted idling near Henderson's pharmacy around the time the girls passed by. Several witnesses recalled it. Dented right fender, rust near the wheel well, partial plate 7:4. No one could see the driver clearly. Just a silhouette. A man wearing a cap. Deputies traced every blue pickup in Pike County, over 100. One belonged to James Whitley, a mechanic who worked 2 blocks from the diner. He claimed he'd been there, yes, but his truck had overheated. His wife said he was home by 9. With no evidence and no probable cause, the sheriff let him go. The Martinez family, meanwhile, refused to stop searching. Robert spent his days walking the route between the diner and home, searching drainage ditches and abandoned barns. He carried a flashlight even in daylight, as if expecting to find what the police missed. Maria waited by the window, every car's headlights raising a moment of hope that always died too soon. In small towns, time moves strangely after a disappearance. Days blur, gossip spreads faster than truth, and fear becomes part of the air. People who once trusted each other started whispering behind closed doors. Neighbors accused neighbors. Someone said the girls were seen at a gas station in Georgia. Another swore they were spotted at a diner in Mississippi. Every lead evaporated. The sheriff repeated the same line at every press conference. We're pursuing all available leads. Eights. But behind that lie was exhaustion and inexperience. Pike County's 11 deputies had no homicide training, no forensic tools. The only piece of potential evidence, a blue hair ribbon found on Pine Street, was bagged and forgotten. For Robert Martinez, that failure was unforgivable. He'd trusted the system once. He never would again. Psychologists who later studied the case said the illusion of safety was its cruelest element. Routine is the predator's camouflage. It tells victims they're safe because everything feels familiar. But predators thrive on predictability. They watch, they wait, and they strike in the gap between comfort and caution. Sarah and Rebecca didn't make a mistake. They followed the same path they always had. It was the world around them that shifted. The same main street that had felt safe became a hunting ground. By the end of that first week, hope turned to dread. The sheriff's office stopped the daily press briefings. The posters began to curl at the edges. Halloween came and went, but no trick-or-treaters knocked on the Martinez door. Maria couldn't bring herself to take down the porch light. She said, "I'll leave it on until they come home." Eights. Years later, locals would recall that small light burning in the window, visible from the end of Pine Street. It became a symbol, the town's conscience flickering in the dark. But on that first October weekend in 1974, Pike County didn't know it was writing the opening chapter of a tragedy that would span generations. What began as 2 missing person reports would one day fill entire cold case files, studied by detectives who weren't even born when the twins vanished. At the time, all the town had were questions, whispered prayers, and one lingering image. Eights. 2 identical sisters walking side by side under a halo of streetlight, unaware that someone was following. Maybe it was that blue truck. Maybe it was someone they knew. Or maybe the darkness itself had been watching, patient as stone. Whatever the truth, it disappeared with them that night, sealed away like the air in the Blackwood mine. And as the years passed, those 12 minutes between Murphy's Diner and the Martinez home would become the most analyzed stretch of pavement in Alabama. A road that looked ordinary in daylight, but carried a shadow you could still feel at dusk. Because once innocence is broken, no town ever feels the same again. If you've ever felt safe walking a familiar street, drop a below, because every cold case file starts with someone who thought they were safe. By the second week after the twins vanished, Pike County no longer breathed the way it once had. The town that had thrived on open doors and first-name hellos now moved with quiet suspicion. Curtains stayed drawn. Conversations stopped when strangers entered a room. Fear had changed the air. It carried weight. The Martinez disappearance wasn't just a family tragedy anymore. It had become a mirror reflecting everything fragile beneath the town's friendly surface. 25. As Zalman people scattered across farmland and narrow streets, each convinced they knew their neighbors. But suddenly, no one was certain of anything. The sheriff's department, 11 men, 1 secretary, and a single rust-red patrol car that barely held a radio signal, had never handled a homicide. Sheriff Walter Donovan, a man more politician than peacekeeper, liked his photo in the Troy Messenger more than he liked field work. "We're pursuing all available leads," he told reporters, the same phrase every night until it became meaningless. Behind the microphones, his deputies were stumbling through darkness without a map. The blue pickup truck dominated every conversation. Witnesses disagreed about its color. Some said navy, some sky blue. A teenage couple claimed it circled the block twice. A church janitor swore it was parked near the alley only once. Each statement shifted the timeline like sand underwater. And yet, no one dared to consider that the driver might be someone they already knew. How well do you really know your neighbors? It's a question that feels rhetorical until a pair of sisters disappears and every familiar face starts to look like a mask. Within a week, rumor replaced evidence. A farmer told the barber he'd seen tire tracks leading into the woods. A waitress whispered that a traveling salesman had been hanging around the diner. The local radio station turned speculation into talk show fuel. Each rumor that surfaced eventually found its way into the cold case files, scribbled on yellow paper, dated, and filed, tiny seeds of confusion that would sprout again decades later. In churches, pastors urged prayer but avoided saying the twins' names aloud, afraid to anchor evil too close. In the grocery store, Maria Martinez felt stares follow her down the aisles. Some whispered that Robert knew more than he admitted. Others said the girls might have run away, that maybe their father's strictness had pushed them too hard. Gossip doesn't need proof, it only needs repetition. For the investigators, each rumor became another lead to chase. Victor Ramirez, a cousin visiting from Arizona, was questioned for hours after someone remembered he'd flirted with Sarah once. Thomas Blackwell, the mine owner, became a target after a whispered argument with Robert about safety standards. Daniel Cooper, Rebecca's ex-boyfriend, volunteered for a polygraph just to prove his innocence. None of it led anywhere. The investigation expanded outward like a ripple with no center, spreading thin until it lost force. Meanwhile, reporters arrived from Montgomery and Birmingham. Television crews filled the courthouse steps with cables and questions. National networks aired segments on the vanishing twins of Troy, turning the quiet Alabama town into a spectacle. Locals both hated and needed the attention. Businesses sold fewer pies, but more newspapers. Every stranger looked like a possible predator or journalist. Psychologists later called this stage collective fear, a self-sustaining panic in which safety becomes suspicion. When certainty collapses, the human mind reaches for blame. It's easier to believe someone must be responsible, anyone, than to face the abyss of not knowing. By November, Pike County had split into camps. Those who believed the girls were abducted by an outsider, and those convinced the killer lived among them. The first group locked their doors and eyed highway drifters. The second started looking inward, teachers, mechanics, church deacons, anyone who didn't join the search parties. Deputy Brooks, who had first dismissed the family's panic, now led the night patrols. He barely slept. Each time his radio crackled, his stomach tightened. They found nothing but stray dogs and shadowed barns. Yet every rustle in the cornfields made his heart race. It felt, he would later say, like evil had a heartbeat. 8. The deeper the fear ran, the more fragile friendships became. Families who had eaten Sunday lunch together for decades stopped speaking. The Martinez family, once surrounded by support, now faced quiet avoidance. People crossed the street to avoid their grief. They're cursed, some said. Bad luck follows the house. 8. The case had become a wound the town didn't know how to dress. Inside the sheriff's office, boxes piled higher. Leads that once felt urgent turned stale within days. Deputies filled out reports with shaking hands, knowing none of it made sense. Without physical evidence, no crime scene, no weapon, the case turned into paperwork instead of progress. Cognitive dissonance set in. The town wanted to believe in its own goodness. If evil existed, it had to come from outside. So, when the leads pointed back toward local names, people found reasons to look away. Not him, they said. He's from here. 8. It's human nature. We protect our narratives more fiercely than our truths. That winter, the local paper ran its last front-page story on the twins. The headline read, "Search effort winding down." Underneath, a photo of volunteers with lanterns fading into the dark woods. For Maria Martinez, that image was unbearable. She clipped it anyway, folded it carefully, and tucked it inside her Bible. The longer the case dragged on, the more it transformed from a mystery to a myth. Children whispered stories about ghostly twin girls walking Pine Street at night. Teenagers dared each other to knock on the Martinez door. The tragedy became entertainment, a coping mechanism for people who couldn't live with the idea that real evil might be ordinary. Behind closed doors, the Martinez family disintegrated. Robert turned his garage into a search headquarters. Maria turned their living room into a shrine. Lucia and Miguel drifted between them, learning too early that grief can be contagious. Meanwhile, Sheriff Donovan faced re-election pressure. Donors wanted reassurance, voters wanted closure. He promised progress he didn't have. By spring 1975, the posters came down. The Martinez file was labeled inactive, pending new leads. Eights. But inactive didn't mean forgotten. It meant suspended in guilt. In 1979, when a new sheriff reopened the investigation, he found the office records in disarray, handwritten notes, missing photos, evidence bags unsealed. The cold case files weren't just incomplete, they were contaminated by time, mishandling, and human error. Each rumor from 1974 had been logged as if it were fact. In trying to record everything, they'd made it impossible to find the truth. From a psychological standpoint, Pike County had entered the guilt transfer stage. Those who'd failed the twins, the deputies, the neighbors, even the witnesses, buried their shame by rewriting the story. People started remembering things differently. Some swore they'd seen a suspicious man months earlier. Others claimed the twins once mentioned leaving town. Memory bent to protect the ego. By the late 1980s, when outsiders asked about the case, locals sighed and said, "That's old business." The mine closed, the diner changed owners, and time turned the tragedy into background noise. Yet underneath that polite silence, there was still a current, an unease that never left. You can still feel it if you drive through Troy after dark. The courthouse clock ticks too loudly. The wind through the oaks sounds like whispering. And somewhere between Maine and Pine, the air feels colder than it should. That chill isn't superstition, it's history refusing to settle. Sociologists studying Pike County later identified a pattern called community denial. When a crime cuts too deep into collective identity, the mind of the town behaves like a single organism, defensive, avoidant, rewriting reality to survive. It tells itself, that kind of thing doesn't happen here, even when it already has. But denial has a cost. Each generation that ignored the Martinez case inherited the fear without the facts. Children grew up with bedtime warnings, but no answers. Teachers avoided the topic. Churches prayed around it. The wound stayed open. And in that silence, one man walked freely through the years, shopping in the same stores, attending the same services, knowing exactly what he'd buried. In 1974, no one looked twice at Howard Keller, the quiet maintenance supervisor from Blackwell Mining. He'd been interviewed briefly because of his connection to Robert Martinez, but nothing stood out. Married, steady job, lived 6 blocks away. Ordinary. Too ordinary. He even joined a volunteer search one weekend, holding a flashlight, asking questions, nodding in sympathy. That night, he went home to the same house where he'd later hide his wife's journal, the one that would, decades later, reveal everything. But in 1974, no one saw him. The town wasn't ready to suspect its own reflection. And so Pike County carried on, half awake, half haunted. Farmers tilled fields, students graduated, the world moved on. Yet, Every October, when the air turned sharp and the leaves began to fall, people felt that quiet ache, the sense that something precious had been stolen and never returned. The Martinez twins had become part of the landscape, ghosts woven into the rhythm of a town that no longer trusted itself. It would take 45 years, a new generation of detectives, and one accidental discovery in a forgotten mine shaft to bring the truth to light. But before that day came, Pike County would endure decades of pretending, of layering normalcy over fear like paint on a cracked wall. Because that's what small towns do when innocence dies. They cover it up and call it history. If this glimpse into small town secrets chills you, hit like, it tells YouTube to keep these cold case files alive. The search parties faded. The reporters left. And when the last flashbulb popped outside the Martinez home, the family was finally alone with the silence. It was winter by then. The leaves that had once rustled along Pine Street were gone, leaving the branches bare like the bones of something ancient. Inside the small two-bedroom house, time stopped moving. Calendars stayed open to October. The radio stayed off. Every creak in the floorboards felt like it might be the sound of the door opening. That house became both a home and a grave. Robert Martinez, once a steady man known for his quiet discipline, began to unravel. Before the disappearance, he'd been the kind of father who fixed things, the leaky faucet, the flickering porch light, the wobbly chair. After the twins vanished, his hands still moved, but never to fix anything. They built instead a command center of desperation. The garage that had once smelled of oil and sawdust became an investigation room. Maps covered the walls, lines of red string connecting neighborhoods, abandoned shacks, old mine shafts. He used colored pins, red for places searched, blue for sightings, yellow for possibilities. When the table ran out of space, he moved to the walls. When the walls filled, he used the ceiling beams. He installed a second phone line that rang only for tips. Flyers in nearby towns listed the number beneath his daughter's photos. He checked it constantly, day and night. Most calls were dead ends. Some were cruel pranks. But every time it rang, his pulse quickened, because maybe this time... He kept records like a detective, but lived like a ghost. Neighbors saw him walking roadsides at dawn with a flashlight even after sunrise. He'd crawl through drainage ditches, explore old barns, and climb through forest ravines alone. He marked every search on a map. When he came home, his clothes smelled of dirt and rain, and Maria would silently hand him a towel. No words were needed. They both knew he'd found nothing. Grief, psychologists say, has stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. But Robert never moved through them. He stayed trapped between the second and third, where anger becomes action. His grief didn't make him weep. It made him dig. At first, people admired him. Then they pitied him. Then they avoided him. The man who once joined barbecues and Sunday services now spoke only in timelines and theories. His voice was a whisper of obsession. And when obsession replaces hope, it stops being love and becomes something else entirely, a compulsion, a survival mechanism. By 1976, Robert's health began to falter. He'd lost 20 pounds. His heart murmured under the strain. Doctors warned him to rest. But how do you rest when you believe your daughters might still be calling from somewhere in the dark? If it were your daughters, he once told a deputy who suggested he move on, would you stop searching just because the world got tired of hearing about them? 8s. He meant it. And no one had an answer. While Robert fought the world outside, Maria Martinez waged a quieter war inside their home. Her faith had always been her anchor, rosary beads beside the bed, Sunday Mass without fail. After the twins vanished, faith became her language of denial. She refused to say the words dead or gone. To her, Sarah and Rebecca were away. Missing implied absence, not death. Missing meant waiting. Each night at 8:45 p.m. The time the girls should have come through the front door, Maria performed the same ritual. She set 2 plates at the dinner table, real food, real silverware, and waited. Sometimes she prayed aloud. Sometimes she just listened to the ticking clock. When midnight came, she would cover the plates with a towel and leave them untouched until morning. Every Thursday, she changed the sheets in the twins' bedroom, dusted their frame photos, and opened the window just enough to let in the night air. "So they can find their way home," she'd whisper. Her neighbors stopped visiting. Their pity became too heavy. Even the priest advised her to accept God's plan. But Maria had already chosen her own form of worship. Her religion became memory. From the outside, the house looked like any other on Pine Street: white siding, neat garden, a cross on the wall. But step inside, and time stood still. A faint scent of perfume lingered in the girls' room. Clothes hung in their closet, pressed and clean, waiting for owners who would never return. On the dresser, Rebecca's guitar leaned against the wall. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons, Maria strummed its strings softly, a hymn for the lost. Her grief was not fire like Robert's. It was water, calm but endless, shaping everything around it. And yet, that calm was its own form of denial. She never let herself drown, but she never reached the shore either. In the shadow of their parents' devotion stood Miguel and Lucia, the forgotten children. When the twins vanished, Miguel was 15, Lucia 12. Overnight, their world collapsed. School friends didn't know what to say. Teachers gave them extra time on assignments but avoided eye contact. Classmates whispered in hallways. Miguel responded by retreating. He buried himself in textbooks, sports, anything that gave structure. His silence was his rebellion. He wouldn't let grief swallow him like it did his parents. But silence has a cost. It isolates. He graduated top of his class, earned a scholarship, and left Alabama for college in California. People called him brave. He called it escape. Lucia, on the other hand, stayed. Someone had to. She became her mother's anchor and her father's assistant. She typed letters to police, made phone calls, updated flyers. As she grew older, she learned to speak the language of sorrow fluently, measured words, soft voice, steady eyes. In interviews, she became the family's spokesperson, CEO. Her strength looked like peace, but it was just exhaustion wearing makeup. Psychologists call it survivor's guilt, the belief that living on is somehow betrayal. Miguel carried it across states. Lucia carried it in the same house. Both inherited the same wound in different shapes. By the early 1980s, the house itself had become part of Pike County folklore. Locals called it the house that never slept. People claimed they saw lights burning at all hours, heard faint music at night. Teenagers dared each other to knock on the door. None ever stayed long. The sadness inside was too real, too human. Robert kept expanding his search maps. The colors faded from sunlight, but the pins multiplied. By now, the lines looked like veins of obsession spreading across the walls. He corresponded with detectives from neighboring counties, even mailed letters to the FBI in Washington. Most replies were polite dismissals. Still, he pressed on. Each anniversary, he walked the original route between the diner and home, marking the distance with small wooden stakes. Locals began to avoid him on those walks. They said it was like watching a man haunted by ghosts only he could see. Maria's faith deepened into ritual. Every Sunday, she lit candles for the twins and left them burning long after the service ended. The church janitor started saving melted wax just to keep up with her offerings. The twins' birthdays were the hardest. Maria baked a cake every year. She wrote both names on it, set it between two chairs, and sang softly to the empty room. If it were your daughters, you might ask yourself, how long would you keep doing it? A year? 5? 45? 8s? For Maria, time wasn't linear anymore. It was circular, every day another October evening. When Robert's health declined, Lucia convinced him to see a doctor. The diagnosis was heart disease, worsened by stress and lack of rest. He ignored the warnings. "If my heart gives out," he told her, "let it be while I'm looking." 8s. He spent his final working years compiling notes into binders, hundreds of pages labeled leads, witnesses, theories. When technology changed, he bought a used typewriter to replace his handwritten ones. The garage grew into an archive of obsession, one man's lifetime carved into paper. For him and Maria, those binders weren't just evidence, they were scripture. For them, the cold case files weren't paperwork, they were sacred scripture. Every faded photo, every rumor, every dead lead was a verse in a gospel of loss. The binders outlived him. They would later guide the detectives who finally solved the case, though Robert never knew it. In the 1990s, when the sheriff's office briefly reopened the case, Lucia attended every meeting. She handed over her father's notes, begged them to re-examine the blue pickup angle, and left with the same hollow promise she'd heard her whole life. "We'll look into it." 8s. Each time the case reopened, hope flickered. Each time it went cold again, that flicker burned a little piece of her away. By the time the new millennium arrived, Maria was an old woman with silver hair and trembling hands. She still kept her vigil by the window every evening, even after her eyesight dimmed. The neighbors' children didn't know her name. They just called her the Lady Who Waits. 8s. The ritual never changed. 2 plates, 2 prayers, one mother's refusal to let the world move on. If grief had a geography, it would look like that house on Pine Street, a small square of earth where time refused to pass. And yet, through all that silence, their persistence mattered. Because those binders in the garage, the ones filled with Robert's maps and Mariah's notes, would one day end up on the desk of a young deputy named Marcus Tanner, the man who would later uncover the mine's hidden chamber. The family's obsession became the foundation of justice. Every page of their pain would turn out to be a breadcrumb leading back to truth. They didn't know it then, but their devotion kept the trail alive, waiting for science and time to catch up. Share this story so the families still trapped inside these cold case files are never forgotten. Time has a strange way of erasing what it doesn't want to remember. After the chaos of the 1970s faded, Pike County settled into a quieter rhythm. The mine still smoked on the horizon, the church bells still rang every Sunday, and people spoke of the Martinez twins less and less, not because they stopped caring, but because caring had become too heavy to carry. The 1980s arrived with new sheriffs, new promises, and the same unanswered questions. Sheriff Walter Donovan, whose re-election had once depended on the case, lost to Raymond Tucker, a former state trooper with a reputation for persistence. In his first press conference, Tucker promised what every new sheriff promises, to finish what his predecessor could not. For a moment, the county believed him. The press called it a fresh start. But cases like this don't restart easily. The evidence boxes from 1974 were warped with humidity, their labels fading. Photos had curled from heat. Tape peeled away. Inside, each folder smelled faintly of mildew and regret. Detectives re-interviewed old witnesses, but memory is fragile. The pharmacy clerk, Judith Abernathy, could no longer recall what time the twins left her store. The teenage couple had married and moved away. Their statements contradicted their original ones. Even the blue pickup sighting had blurred into uncertainty. Witnesses weren't lying. They were remembering what time had rewritten. 45 years is a long time for truth to survive in human memory. And yet, Sheriff Tucker refused to close the case again. He brought in a retired FBI consultant to profile the unknown suspect. The profiler described him as a local male, likely familiar with the victims, organized, and able to conceal his crime effectively. It wasn't much, but it was something. It narrowed the field to almost every man in Pike County. The task force combed through employment records, cross-referencing names with vehicle registrations, but nothing pointed anywhere definitive. By 1981, Tucker's budget was drained, and his task force disbanded. The Martinez case went dormant once more, its promise fading like a photograph left in the sun. In those same years, Pike County began to change. The sleepy rural town that once measured life by church bells and football games started to modernize. A new 4-lane highway cut through farmland. Chain restaurants sprouted where tobacco barns once stood. Murphy's Diner closed in 1986, its neon sign replaced by a video rental store. Henderson's Pharmacy was bought by a national drug chain, its wooden counter replaced with sterile aisles of fluorescent light. Progress came with a price. It paved over memory. The younger generation heard of the Martinez twins as local folklore, a campfire story for restless teens. They said the girls' spirits walked Pine Street each October, their laughter echoing from somewhere you couldn't see. Some kids left flowers on the sidewalk, others spray-painted, "Where are they?" on the bridge overpass. Myth replaced fact because myth was easier. In myth, tragedy becomes controllable, a story you can tell and end whenever you want. But for Maria and Lucia, the story never ended. Robert passed away in the late 1990s, his heart finally surrendering after decades of overwork and obsession. He died believing his daughters were out there somewhere, waiting to be found. At his funeral, the sheriff's department sent 2 deputies. They stood in silence near the back pew. Maria didn't speak. She sat clutching the same silver rosary she had used every night since 1974. The string had frayed, the cross had dulled. Faith, like metal, wears down slowly. After Robert's death, the house grew quieter still. Lucia moved her mother's bed to the front window so she could keep her vigil from there. Every evening, Maria sat with her hands folded, staring at the street where her daughters once walked. Outside, the world kept changing, but the Martinez home remained untouched, a relic in the middle of progress. The porch light still burned, though the bulb had been changed dozens of times. Neighbors joked that it would outlast them all. In 1994, a spark of hope reignited. The FBI announced the use of DNA technology in cold case investigations, and local papers ran stories about decades-old crimes finally being solved through science. Lucia clipped the article and took it straight to Sheriff Tucker's successor, Margaret Lawson, one of Alabama's first female sheriffs. Lawson agreed to reopen the file, sending what little evidence remained to the state lab in Montgomery. But science can only resurrect what was properly preserved. Most of the physical samples from 1974, hair strands, soil residues, fabric fibers, had been mishandled or degraded over time. Moisture and mold had erased what DNA might have existed. The few surviving fragments were too contaminated to process. The lab's report was a single paragraph. Insufficient quality material for analysis. 8. Lucia remembered the phone call vividly. She'd waited for years, hoping the word finally might precede results. Instead, she heard the technician sigh and say, "I'm sorry, Ms. Martinez. There's nothing left to test." 8. She hung up, closed her eyes, and whispered, "Not yet. Just not yet." 8. By the 1990s, their file sat aging in the basement, another cold case file fading under dust. The new millennium arrived, and with it came the illusion of progress. The internet changed how communities remembered. Online forums sprang up where amateur detectives dissected old mysteries. Someone uploaded the Martinez flyer to a missing persons website. True crime blogs began listing the case among Alabama's unsolved. But for every new digital mention, the real evidence remained trapped in boxes that no one opened anymore. Pike County's population grew as people from Montgomery moved south, chasing cheaper land. The newcomers didn't know the old stories. The Martinez house was just another address with overgrown roses and a tired front porch. Still, the legend lingered. Each October, locals left candles at the base of the courthouse statue. Some said it was superstition. Others said it was guilt. By 2002, Alabama had established its first official cold case unit. For the first time in decades, the Martinez twins file was logged into a statewide database. The detective scanning through it noticed something peculiar. Meticulous notes written by Robert himself. His maps, his phone logs, his handwritten witness lists. They were better organized than the original police work. Those notes caught the attention of a young investigator named Diana Reeves, who specialized in historical reconstructions. She called Lucia, who was now in her 40s, and asked to visit. For the first time in years, the house on Pine Street saw flashing lights again, but this time, they belonged to hope. Reeves spent hours in Robert's garage, photographing each binder, tagging every document. When she left, she hugged Maria's trembling hands and promised, "We'll look again." 8. And they did. The case went digital. For the first time, every note, photograph, and report lived not just in a file cabinet, but on a screen. But digital hope can fade as quickly as real memory. When budget cuts hit the department in 2005, the cold case unit shrank. Reeves was reassigned. The Martinez investigation fell silent once more, its progress buried beneath newer tragedies. It's called survivor's fatigue, when a community grows tired of its own pain. People stop expecting miracles. They move on because staying hurts too much. You might understand the feeling, the quiet surrender that follows too many disappointments. Could you keep believing for 45 years? Maria did. Every night, she prayed the same prayer. Every morning, she whispered the same names. Even after her eyesight dimmed, she could still trace their faces by memory. By 2010, she was 80 years old, frail but lucid. A local reporter interviewed her for a documentary about Alabama's oldest missing persons cases. When asked what she wanted most, she didn't hesitate. "Not revenge," she said softly. "Just truth." 8. The segment aired on local television for one night. The audience was small, but among the few who watched was a rookie deputy named Marcus Tanner. He was 22, barely out of the academy. He didn't know then that 10 years later, he would be the one to find the truth buried under that mine. By the 2010s, Pike County looked almost unrecognizable. The courthouse was renovated, the mine fenced off, and the diner's lot replaced by a cell phone store. Yet, beneath the new asphalt and LED lights, the old town still whispered. The Blackwood mine, long closed and sealed, became a local dare spot for teenagers. Its tunnels echoed with spray paint, laughter, and beer cans. No one imagined it hid anything real, just the ghosts of rumors. And then, in October 2019, one call changed everything. Deputy Marcus Tanner received a routine dispatch. Reports of trespassers at the abandoned Blackwood site. He almost ignored it, a Saturday night nuisance call. But he drove out anyway. The mine was 30 miles outside Pike County, its entrance half swallowed by kudzu. He didn't know what waited in that darkness. He didn't know that behind one false wall lay the ending the Martinez family had prayed for across generations. He just grabbed his flashlight, stepped out of his patrol car, and entered the shadows. What he found would not only solve a mystery, it would resurrect the past. October 12th, 2019. The wind whispered through the overgrown entrance of the Blackwood mine, carrying with it the scent of rust, wet earth, and something else, something ancient. Deputy Marcus Tanner parked his cruiser on the cracked gravel road, the headlights cutting twin beams through the dark Alabama woods. The dispatch log said trespassers. Probably kids again. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped into the cold. The mine had been sealed for decades, its entrance blocked with rusted fencing and "Danger, keep out" signs. Yet time has a way of unsealing what people try to forget. The chain-link barrier sagged from years of storms. A small opening gaped near the base, big enough for a teenager or a curious deputy to crawl through. Inside, the air changed. It was thick and stale, tasting faintly of minerals and decay. The beam of his flashlight sliced through floating dust, illuminating wooden beams blackened with age. Water dripped rhythmically somewhere deeper inside. Tanner's boots crunched on gravel and old coal dust. He followed the tunnel for 20 yards before something caught his eye, a section of wall that looked wrong. The rest of the mine was rough rock, jagged and uneven. But this part was smooth, patched with stacked timber and stones. It looked too deliberate. He crouched down. Between two wooden planks, a strip of faded blue cloth protruded like a trapped breath. Tanner froze. Every instinct told him to back out, call for backup. But curiosity pulled harder than fear. He reached out and touched the fabric. It crumbled under his fingers. When he pulled back his hand, a faint scent of decay rose, dry, chemical, lifeless. You move the rock, and time itself breaks open. The first stone came loose easily. Behind it, darkness exhaled. The smell hit him in a wave. Old death, metallic and earthy, the kind that doesn't belong to any animal. He staggered back, heart pounding, as the beam of his flashlight caught something pale. Not rock, not wood, bone. There were two skeletons, side by side, laid with eerie precision in a shallow alcove. Fragments of fabric clung to the remains, blue cotton, the kind used in diner uniforms. And there, near one delicate wrist, half buried in dirt, was a silver locket, tarnished but engraved with two letters that glinted faintly in the light. S.M. Tanner knew immediately. Everyone in Pike County did. Sarah Martinez. He stepped back, trembling. The air felt alive with history, as if the mine itself had been waiting for this moment. 45 years of silence ended with one man's curiosity and a single loosened stone. "Control, this is Deputy Tanner," he said into his radio, voice shaking. I need backup at the old Blackwood site and send the coroner. 8. Within hours, the mine swarmed with flashlights, floodlights, and the low hum of generators. The Pike County Sheriff's Department, the Alabama Bureau of Investigation, and later, the FBI, converged on the scene. The entrance was reinforced by engineers before the forensics teams entered. For the first time in nearly half a century, the Blackwood tunnels echoed not with miners' hammers, but with cameras and evidence markers. Each bone, each fabric scrap, was cataloged, photographed, and lifted from the earth like an artifact of truth. The remains were transported to the University of Alabama's Forensic Anthropology Lab. Dr. Eleanor Simmons, the forensic lead, described the scene later. 8. They weren't dumped. They were placed side by side, hands near each other, as if someone wanted them to stay together, even in death. 8. The medical team's report was grimly precise. Both victims had sustained fractures to the skull, consistent with blunt force trauma. The blows had been delivered from behind. The symmetry suggested control, not chaos. Whoever killed them hadn't acted in panic. They had acted with intention. DNA analysis confirmed what the locket already told the world. The remains were Sarah and Rebecca Martinez. For 45 years, they'd lain behind that false wall, no more than half a mile from where their father once worked his final shift. But death leaves traces even when time tries to erase them. Soil samples taken from around the remains revealed something curious. Tiny particles of an industrial lubricant embedded in the dirt and bone fibers. The chemical signature was distinctive, an exact match to the proprietary lubricant once used exclusively by Blackwell Mining Company in the 1970s. The find meant only one thing. Whoever hid the bodies had access to mining equipment and restricted materials. This wasn't random. It wasn't a drifter or a stranger passing through. It was someone who knew the tunnels intimately, someone from Pike County. When the call reached the Cold Case Files Division, silence finally screamed. The investigation moved fast. Decades of frustration transformed overnight into urgency. Detective Diana Reeves, now leading Alabama's Cold Case Task Force, described the moment she got the call. 8. We'd spent years opening files that went nowhere. But this was different. When I saw Martinez twins on the report, I felt the hair rise on my arms. I knew we were about to rewrite 45 years of history. 8. The forensic evidence told a story technology in 1974 couldn't. Microscopic fiber analysis confirmed that the uniforms found with the bodies were made from a fabric batch ordered specifically by Murphy's Diner that fall. Pollen embedded in the fabric matched the autumn bloom of 1974, pinpointing the time of burial within weeks of their disappearance. But the most damning clue was the lubricant. Blackwell mining records from that era listed only 8 employees who had access to the chemical compound found near the bodies. One of those names had appeared, almost forgettably, in the original witness logs. Howard Keller, maintenance supervisor. In 1974, he'd been interviewed once, provided an alibi confirmed by his wife, and never questioned again. Now, with new technology, new eyes, and old ghosts stirring, his name surfaced like a body in clear water. For Deputy Tanner, the discovery changed everything. He'd grown up hearing about the Martinez twins in whispers, ghost stories told by older cousins. But standing in that tunnel, flashlight trembling, he realized those stories were never just myths. They were warnings that no one had listened to. "It's strange," he told a reporter later. "You grow up thinking ghosts aren't real. Then you find out they've been here all along, just buried under rock." Eights. Science had resurrected the truth. In one moment, the Martinez twins stopped being folklore and became evidence. The mine stopped being an abandoned ruin and became a crime scene. And Pike County, for the first time in decades, stopped pretending its past was buried. Justice had been waiting underground. All it needed was a light. If this discovery hit you like it did me, comment justice below. Let's prove cold case files still matter. The name Howard Keller had been there all along, quiet, unassuming, printed in faded ink on the first page of the investigation logs. His name had been there since page 1 of the cold case files. In 1974, he'd been one of dozens of employees interviewed at Blackwell Mining Company, where Robert Martinez worked as a foreman. He told investigators he'd been home that night, watching television with his wife, Elaine. She confirmed the story. There was no reason to doubt it. Keller wasn't a drifter. He wasn't an outsider. He was one of them. For 45 years, that lie held firm. When detectives reopened the file in 2019, they found a man who'd grown old hiding behind normalcy. Keller was now 80 years old, retired, soft-spoken, the kind of neighbor people waved to but never really knew. His lawn was immaculate, his garbage cans always aligned perfectly on the curb. A model citizen. But monsters don't always live in shadows. Sometimes they live across the street. You might have passed someone like him, the quiet man at church, the friendly neighbor who fixes your mailbox. How many times have you shaken hands with a monster? The new forensic team began reconstructing Keller's past. His employment record showed he'd been the maintenance supervisor at Blackwell in 1974, the very role that granted access to restricted sections of the mine and to the industrial lubricant found on the victim's remains. He was also responsible for sealing off unused tunnels. The section where the sisters were discovered had been marked as sealed in March 1974, 7 months before the twins disappeared. Someone with Keller's expertise would have known exactly how to bypass that barrier, how to hide the evidence, how to make the mine itself an accomplice. Investigators then turned to his personal life. In old newspaper archives, they uncovered 2 earlier incidents from neighboring states. In Tennessee, 1969, Keller had been questioned in the disappearance of a young waitress from a roadside cafe. The case collapsed for lack of evidence. In Mississippi, 1971, he'd been arrested for assaulting a coworker. Charges dropped after the victim refused to testify. There was a pattern, a lifetime of control and evasion. The quiet man who never stood out had perfected invisibility. When police obtained a warrant to search his home in 2019, what they found turned that invisibility into evidence. Inside his garage, neat, labeled, obsessively ordered, officers discovered a locked metal box. Inside, a blue hair ribbon, sealed in a plastic sleeve, a silver charm, broken from a locket, and a maintenance logbook from Blackwell Mining, stolen from the company archives. The charm's surface held a faint smear of dried blood. DNA confirmed it belonged to Sarah Martinez. The hair trapped inside the ribbon matched Rebecca. The logbook contained crude sketches of tunnel dimensions, calculations scribbled in the margins showing how far someone could dig before collapse risk. It wasn't a killer's confession, but it was something more chilling. A map of premeditation. And then came the truck. Witnesses in 1974 had described a blue Ford pickup idling near Henderson's pharmacy the night the twins vanished. Keller had owned one. Records showed he sold it the following year. In 2019, investigators tracked the truck down to a collector in Georgia who'd bought it decades later. Beneath layers of paint and restoration, forensic technicians uncovered traces of blood beneath the passenger seat frame. DNA confirmed the match, Sarah and Rebecca Martinez. Science had finally spoken the words the town refused to say. The arrest came quietly at dawn on October 25th, 2019. Agents surrounded Keller's ranch-style home on Maple Street. The neighborhood watched as an elderly man in a bathrobe stepped outside, blinking in the early light, hands trembling, not from confusion, but from understanding. He knew exactly why they were there. Neighbors gasped. Some wept. Others refused to believe. Keller? One woman whispered to a reporter. He fixed my washing machine last month. Eights. But evil rarely looks like the monster we expect. It wears human skin and a polite smile. It shakes your hand and mows its lawn. At the sheriff's press conference that afternoon, flashbulbs erupted as Sheriff James Wilson spoke. Eights. After 45 years, we can confirm the arrest of Howard Keller for the murders of Sarah and Rebecca Martinez. Justice delayed, but not denied. Eights. For Pike County, it was like waking from a long nightmare into a colder morning. The trial began in March 2020, under the shadow of a world now distracted by a pandemic. The courtroom, half empty due to distancing rules, still felt suffocating. Lucia Martinez sat in the front row beside her brother, Miguel, who had flown in from California. Their mother, Maria, now 85 and frail, chose not to attend. "I've seen enough darkness," she said. "I'll wait for the light." Eights. Prosecutors presented the evidence like puzzle pieces snapping into place. The DNA from the charm, the ribbon, the truck, the lubricant, the mine diagrams, the timeline. But the most damning revelation came not from science, but from words written decades earlier. Hidden in the attic of Keller's home, investigators found Elaine Keller's journals. In them, she described years of abuse, control, and fear. One entry, dated 1974, read, "Eights. He came home late that night, covered in dirt. I asked where he'd been. He looked at me with eyes I didn't recognize and said, 'Don't ever ask again.' I lied to the police because I was scared. I've lived with that lie ever since." Eights. Her confession from beyond the grave broke the courtroom's silence. When the defense tried to argue senility and poor health, the prosecution countered with precision. "Age doesn't erase intent," the district attorney said. "It only delays the consequences." Eights. The jury deliberated 6 hours. Verdict: guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. Judge Eleanor Simmons, who had once overseen the forensic recovery at the mine, delivered the sentence herself. Eights. Mr. Keller, for 45 years you lived as a free man among the people you deceived. Today, you will live the rest of your life in a cell among the truth you cannot escape. Eights. 2 life sentences. No parole. When news of the verdict reached Maria, she simply closed her eyes and whispered, "Now I can sleep." Eights. A week later, she asked Lucia to pack away the twins' belongings for the first time in 45 years. The beds were stripped, the books boxed, the locket returned to the family, cleaned, polished, and whole again. Keller died in prison in 2022, never offering an apology, never revealing what exactly happened in those final minutes of October 17th, 1974. His silence died with him. But truth, once unearthed, doesn't need confession. It breathes on its own. Every town has its secrets. Every street, its ghosts. The people of Pike County now live with both: the darkness they ignored and the justice they finally faced. And maybe, when you pass a quiet old man who smiles too easily, you'll remember this story and wonder, what would 45 years of silence sound like if it finally spoke? Justice delayed, but not denied. Subscribe now, because every view keeps another cold case file open. When the verdict was read, something shifted in Pike County. It wasn't loud or triumphant. There were no cheers, no celebrations, just a quiet exhale that rippled through decades of grief. After 45 years, the town finally stopped holding its breath. For the Martinez family, justice arrived like sunrise through fog. Beautiful, but too late for the ones who had waited the longest. Robert Martinez, the father who searched until his heart gave out, passed away just 2 weeks after Keller's sentencing. He died in his sleep, his maps and notes still pinned to the garage wall, his promise fulfilled. At his funeral, his daughter Lucia placed 2 roses on his casket, one for Sarah, one for Rebecca, and whispered, "You found them, Daddy. You finally did." 8. Maria, frail but serene, lived long enough to see peace return to her home. After the trial, she packed away her daughter's belongings for the first time in 45 years. The 2 empty chairs at the dinner table were finally removed, the ritual complete. She donated the twins' clothes and books to a local women's shelter, keeping only Rebecca's guitar and Sarah's silver locket. Neighbors say she still sits by the window each evening, not waiting anymore, but remembering. When asked if she forgave the man who took her daughters, she only smiled softly and said, "Eights, forgiveness isn't for him. It's for us, for the living." In the years that followed, Lucia and Miguel Martinez transformed their pain into purpose. Together, they established the Martinez Foundation for Cold Case Research, a nonprofit dedicated to funding forensic advancements and supporting rural law enforcement agencies. The foundation's motto, engraved on its seal, reads, "Time cannot silence truth." 8. Through their efforts, more than a dozen forgotten cases across Alabama have been reopened, families given hope, names restored, justice reborn. The same DNA technology that identified Sarah and Rebecca has now been used to solve crimes once thought unsolvable. Today, the Martinez twins no longer rest inside the cold case files. They live in every breakthrough their story inspired. Pike County changed. 2. The courthouse now holds an annual memorial for victims of unsolved crimes. A bronze plaque bearing the sisters' names stands outside Murphy's Diner's former site, where locals and travelers stop to leave flowers. The old Blackwood mine has been sealed again, this time permanently, with a marker reading, 8. Here ended the silence. 8. High school students study the case as part of a new curriculum on justice and community awareness. Sheriff's deputies receive yearly training on cold case preservation, funded by the Martinez Foundation. What began as tragedy became transformation. The town that once whispered about its ghosts now speaks openly about its lessons. Vigilance, empathy, and the quiet courage to look closer. Because evil doesn't always hide in the dark. It hides in plain sight, behind familiar faces and polite smiles. And as time moves forward, the story of Sarah and Rebecca continues to echo. Not as horror, but as testimony, proof that truth, though buried, never dies. Maybe that's what real justice looks like. Not revenge, not punishment, but memory that endures. If it were your family, if someone you loved vanished into the dark, would you stop searching after a year? 5 years? 45? Would you keep a light burning in the window, hoping the truth might one day find its way home? Because in the end, every family waiting for answers lives the same story. Different names, different faces, but the same unbearable silence, waiting for someone to break it. And that's why we tell these stories. To keep the lights burning. To give voice to those time tried to erase. And to remind ourselves that sometimes justice doesn't come quickly. It comes completely. Turn on the bell and stay with us as we reopen more cold case files, because silence only ends when stories are told.